Hi, thank you for inviting me. Can you all hear me in the back? Yep, okay. Thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk mainly about Hadrian's Attic deme of Bessa, so Il Demo di Bessa in Atene. Herodes, Atticus, and Hadrian, two names that loom large in the history of Athens, two figures whose legacies are imprinted on the city's monumental landscape. While much has been written about their shared architectural ambitions and cultural contributions, less attention has been given to their relationships with the Attic countryside, an area that shaped their identities. Both men, citizens of rural demes, engaged with Attica not just as a backdrop for political and social activity, but as a canvas for their ideals and leisure pursuits. In this paper, I shall very briefly explore this often overlooked connection, focusing mainly on Hadrian's deme of Bessa, a subject brought to light by new research from the multidisciplinary Bessa project, in which I serve as the principal investigator. The main question that I will answer today is why Hadrian chose to register in this seemingly remote deme of Attica, and more importantly, given his many sojourns in Athens, both before and during his reign as emperor, did he actually own property at Bessa? By exploring the intricate dynamics of Hadrian's ties to this deme and situating them alongside Herodes' attachment to his home deme of Marathon, I will demonstrate how the countryside of Attica was not merely a setting, but an active participant in their stories and shaped the ways they expressed their ideals. Now, you might be curious about why I developed an interest in this relatively obscure Attic deme. I must say that up until a few years ago, the only thing I knew about Bessa was that it was the deme of Hadrian and Philopappos. As I'm writing a book on Hadrian and Hellenism, I've been particularly intrigued by the question of where he resided during his numerous visits to Athens, both before and during his reign as emperor. When I discussed this topic with a few colleagues in Greece, their reply was simply that Hadrian was registered at Bessa. Είχε πολιτογραφηθεί στη Βύσσα, they said to me. But I was not convinced that he was merely registered there, given what we know from the historical and epigraphic sources. Well, what do we know about Hadrian's connection to Bessa and his early engagement with the city of Athens in particular? We know from an inscription in the Agora that he was registered in this deme. So if you have your handouts, he is number 10 in your handout, in your folder. We know that he was eponymous Archon of Athens from 111 to 112. He was also the first Roman emperor to ascend the throne as an Athenian citizen, which is very important. He was the first Roman emperor to be both an Athenian citizen and a Roman citizen. And before him, Domitian had been an eponymous Archon of Athens, but he held this office in absentia when he was emperor. So Hadrian was in Athens as an eponymous Archon, but Domitian was not. It was an honorary title. The year 111 to 112 was not Hadrian's first sojourn in Athens. He likely studied in the city with the Syrian rhetorician Isaios around the year 100. Both Juvenal and Philostratos provide accounts of Isaios visiting Rome, but there's no documented evidence of his teaching there. However, it is known that he resided in Athens, and he was probably registered in the deme of Meliti, in the center of the city. Following his term as eponymous Archon in 112, Hadrian likely remained in the city until the following year and hosted Trajan, the reigning emperor, and of course also his former guardian. Trajan had come to Athens to meet with an embassy of the Parthian king Osroes in 113, and it is likely that he stayed in Hadrian's property in Attica. And as we all know, as emperor, Hadrian visited Athens at least 3 times, staying there for many months at a time. The question that naturally arises out of all of this then is, well, where did he establish his residence in Athens, particularly before assuming the role of emperor? I mean, he wasn't like couch surfing with Philopappos or Claudius Atticus. He was living somewhere, so the question is, where was he living? It is highly improbable that he, along with Sabina, resided in the Marathon estate of Claudius Atticus, who was by then one of the wealthiest men in Athens and a friend of the imperial family. Similarly, it is unlikely that Hadrian lived in the estate of Philopappos in Bessa, as hypothesized by Paul Grindor and others. Roman noblemen, like Hadrian, traveled with a sizable entourage, which included family members, guards, secretaries, and other attendants. Accommodating such a large group for an extended period of time, meaning many months or years, would have placed a considerable financial strain on potential hosts. Given his registration in the deme of Bessa, then, it stands to reason that Hadrian must have owned property in that deme. And the way property worked in Athens was that it was usually transmitted from father to son, but if you became an Athenian citizen, you had to have some kind of property in the deme in which you were registered. So it's kind of like when you became a Roman citizen in Rome, you had to own property. So it kind of worked the same way in Athens. Some rather indirect evidence for the fact that Hadrian also owned property in Athens or at Bessa comes from a passage in Philostratos, which states that Antium was Hadrian's favorite palaces of the ones in Italy. So as you can see here, I can barely make it out because it's in red. The Greek text says, «Εις μάλιστα δι τον περί την Ιταλίαν βασιλείον έχερεν». So basically, Antium was that one of his Italian palaces in which this emperor took the most pleasure. Now, this statement implies that Hadrian owned property outside Italy. It's a little bit cryptic, but why would Philostratus say of his Italian palaces? So this means that he owned property outside of Italy. It is definite, of course, that he possessed estates in his native Spain and Italica, right? And probably also maybe his mother's in Gades. But given his eponymous archonship and frequent visits to Athens as emperor, it is likely that he owned at least one estate in the city. While his main residence was probably in his home deme of Bessa, he may, of course, have owned property in the center of Athens as well. Imperial ownership of villa estates in Greece was probably more widespread than our current literary and archaeological evidence suggests. Suetonius, for instance, asserts that during Tiberius's 6-year residency in Rhodes as a private individual, he possessed 2 unassuming villas on the island, one in Rhodes town and another in an unspecified location. Furthermore, there's an association between Nero and a villa at Olympia, suggesting his possible residence there during his participation in the Olympic Games. Thus, Hadrian had earlier imperial precedents when it came to house ownership in Greece. Even some wealthy sophists other than Herodes Atticus owned multiple villas in Greece, as the case of Proclus of Naucratis suggests. Philostratos tells us that Proclus bought 4 houses, 2 in Athens itself, 1 in Piraeus, and another at Eleusis. So with all of this information in mind then, I set out to learn more about Hadrian's deme of Bessa. To my astonishment, this deme had been largely overlooked in both historical and archaeological studies. Despite a handful of rescue excavations conducted by the Effort of Antiquities of East Attica since the 1980s, the focus was generally not on the remains of Bessa during the Roman period, and there was a broader lack of interest in the deme's historical context. The epigraphic and literary records provide only meager references to Bessa and its citizens and are confined to a few epigraphic decrees, which briefly mention the mining district of Bessa, and we also have a handful of tombstones of Bessans buried in the center of Athens. But the most significant of the literary references for our purposes is a passage in Xenophon's Oikonomikos, which provides us with the location of the deme. So we have the exact location of the deme from an earlier passage from the classical period. So Xenophon says it's halfway between Thorikos and Anaflistos, with the highest point being the mountain known today as Megalo Ribari. So as you can see on the map, Thorikos is on the right, Thorikos would be to your left, Anaflistos is to your right, and Bessa is right in the middle. This location corresponds to the modern villages of Sinderina, Dimolaki, and part of Agios Konstantinos, as you can see in the red rectangle right there. Before the Roman imperial period, the deme was sparsely populated. In the classical and Hellenistic periods, it was represented by only 2 boulephtes, or councilmen, in the Athenian assembly, and would have had an estimated population of at most 600 citizens. So you get the idea, we're dealing here with one of the smallest demes of Athens. It's not like Meliti or Acharne or Kidathinion, which were pretty big demes, and they could raise about 6,000 or even 7,000 hoplites. This was a deme of 600 people before Hadrian's time. The place name Bessa itself is quite interesting. Strabo mentions a Bessa, spelled with 2 sigmas, in Lokris in central Greece, and provides us with its etymology, which meant wooded valley. So, as it says over there in red, which you can't quite see, Drimodis tis topos, so a place with woods. In a few epigraphic documents and in the Suda Encyclopedia, Attic Bessa is spelled with 2 sigmas, so you can find it spelled both ways. Thus, Attic Bessa similarly conveys the meaning of a wooded valley, which you can see in this image right here. And this is mainly what it looks like today. It's covered in pine trees. In fact, when we work there, we feel like we're basically shooting a Western because it's covered in pine trees, some olive trees, and it's a little bit difficult to navigate. So it's not the easiest place to conduct field work. In the relative absence of literary references to Bessa in the Roman period, then, we must turn to the epigraphic evidence, which is unfortunately rather meager, followed by the even more limited archaeological evidence. As you can see in your handout, Romans were present at Bessa as early as the 1st century BCE. However, it was only in the 1st century CE that the deme began producing prominent figures. In a recent article published in the Classical Quarterly, my colleague and I identified 51 notable Roman citizens from Bessa in the epigraphic record. In the later part of the 1st century CE, Philopappos, he's number 7 in your handout, was its most prominent citizen. His father must have acquired property at Bessa and became an Athenian citizen. Philopappos was a significant figure in imperial Athens, yet we do not know what he looked like, and there are rumors that Philopappos was in fact bearded. But that's just a rumor, and make of it what you like. Philopappos spent most of his lifetime between Rome and Athens and held several prominent positions in both cities. For this reason, it has been suggested that he influenced his younger friend Hadrian to enroll in this deme, which would have occurred in 111 CE at the latest. But apart from the influence of Philopappos, why might Hadrian have preferred Bessa over Marathon or another Athenian deme for his registration? I have identified a few reasons, and I will only talk about a few of them today. The deme's location in South Attica and its modest size made it an ideal place for an estate, offering a retreat from the bustling activity of the city's civic center. However, considering that Bessa is approximately 56 kilometers away from the center of Athens, the distance and the mode of travel to the city's civic center became important factors to consider. I actually calculated the distance and time it would take to get from Bessa to the center of Athens, and it appears that horseback riding, or a horse and carriage, would have taken approximately 10 to 12 hours, contingent, of course, on factors such as speed and the horse's condition and the possibility of changing horses at intervals. But in contrast, if you see the blue arrow, it's not quite an arrow, it's more like a line. So if you see the blue line right there, sailing was actually a much better option. So he could have sailed from Bessa to Piraeus or to Phaleron in only 3 hours. So you don't want to take the overland route. It's going to be like 10 to 12 hours. You want to sail from Bessa to Piraeus. Compare this to Herodes' home deme of Marathon, which was a bit closer to the center of Athens, but really not by much. And obviously the only option for Herodes was to take the land route, unless he wanted to take the long way around Attica, around the peninsula, and just go from Brexisa to Piraeus, which would have taken almost a day to sail. So distances do play a role, and there's a reason that he chose to settle in a place that's 56 kilometers away from the center of Athens. Hadrian and other emperors seem to have preferred villas on the outskirts of Rome that were within a day's travel. His villa here at Tivoli is about 30 kilometers from the city, and his other villa at Antium is about 60 kilometers away. While the location of his villa at Baiae was quite farther south, and I'm thinking that maybe he could have sailed from Baiae as well, since it's so far south compared to the others, most villas frequently used by emperors and noblemen were no more than a day's travel from the city. Of course, most of them, not necessarily all of them. Similarly, if Hadrian's primary residence in Athens was at Bessa, he could have reached the city's center in just 3 to 4 hours by sailing, as we said. So it made sense to sail rather than take the overland route. So far, we have established that Hadrian chose Bessa due to the influence of Philopapos and the deme's rural location. Now, the third reason Hadrian chose to enroll at Bessa is probably the most interesting: the presence of ample hunting grounds. Ancient sources frequently mention Hadrian's passion for hunting, and the demes of South Attica were suitable for this activity. Although Marathon also had excellent hunting grounds, which Herodes, as we heard, used, including those in close proximity to Mount Parnitha in the vicinity of the deme, the pine and oak forests of South Attica seem to have won Hadrian over. It is likely that he first discovered the area during a visit to Philopapos' estate at Bessa, where he may have joined him in a hunting expedition. So what would Hadrian and his contemporaries have hunted in South Attica? The area in which Bessa was located lies on the fringe of the National Preserve of Sunion, which both historically and to a certain extent today abounds in wildlife. The current inhabitants of the region include rabbits, partridges, crows, deer, foxes, and ferrets, which I'm only showing you a few of them here. Furthermore, skeletal remains of wild boar and bears dating back to the early centuries of the Common Era have been discovered by paleontologists in the cave of Kitsos within Bessa's vicinity, indicating the presence of these creatures in antiquity. Both animals are associated with Hadrian in different contexts. He is depicted hunting wild boar on horseback in some of his coins and medallions, and in one of the tondi on the Arch of Constantine in Rome. An epigram composed by him and found at Thespiae in Boeotia reveals that he had killed a bear and dedicated its skin to the local god Eros.
Απίστευτο. Αριογόρνα στο λαύριο.
You have to give the guy credit. I mean, what he's doing is quite dangerous. Bessa's location at the southern edge of the Mesogia plain held a unique appeal. This area was renowned for preserving the pure Attic language. As Philostratus recounts in the life of Herodes, the sophist observed this linguistic purity when he encountered the rustic Agathion. Unlike the city center of Athens, where the influx of non-Greek speakers had diluted the authenticity of the dialect, the Mesogia region, including Bessa, remained unaffected by external influences. For those interested in the traditions and the original Attic dialect, which Hadrian was famous for favoring, areas like the Mesogia and the interior demes of Attica offered a population capable of educating cosmopolitan figures like Hadrian and Herodes in the old Athenian ways. So, okay, I gave you a very brief overview of the literary evidence. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go over the epigraphic evidence, but I will talk a little bit about the archaeological evidence, but it's an entirely different lecture. So I'm only going to show you a tiny bit of the archaeological evidence. What does the situation look like on the ground at Bessa? Oops. Here again, I'm going to be very brief and show you only a couple of images from our land survey. In 2023 and 2024, my team and I conducted field walking within an area of 5 kilometers, and we were able to record a number of features and finds. 2 areas are of particular importance. The first is located on 2 hills facing each other, with one side containing the remains of buildings and the other side containing at least 12 graves. Pottery fragments on the surface show that the time span goes from the 6th century BC to the 6th century AD. So we're dealing with a time span of about 1,000 years, which is crazy if you think about it. But there's also material from the 2nd century. There's plenty of it, in fact. So we're going to have to go back and look at it in more detail. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky to be awarded a grant to do both on-site field work as well as remote sensing and spatial analysis at Bessa. The area on 2 hills that you saw earlier, this, by the way, is what the effort calls the Agora of Bessa. I showed this building to Professor Kouremenos yesterday, and he assures me that it's a public building. He's 90% certain, but we don't know exactly what type of a public building it is, but it's definitely not an agora like the effort of antiquities would like to think. So what we need to do is, in later seasons, just clear it and excavate it, depending on what the effort would like to do. The area on 2 hills that I showed you earlier is the best candidate for household remains and graves of the 2nd century CE. Of course, we would love nothing more than to find the villas of Philopapos and Hadrian at Bessa, but that is obviously a very tall order. So we will be quite busy with Bessa in the next few years, and our aim will be to learn as much as we can about this relatively unknown deme. Okay, to sum up, while Bessa played a relatively minor role in Athenian history and politics from the classical to the early Roman periods, its importance grew significantly in the 2nd century CE, largely due to Hadrian's enrollment in the deme. This decision, influenced by his close friend and fellow Bessan citizen Philopapos, suggests that Hadrian acquired property in the region of Attica before becoming emperor. Like Marathon, the rural appeal of Bessa, with its serene setting and abundant hunting grounds, aligned closely with Hadrian's interest in hunting and the pure Attic dialect, both features which would have factored into his choice. As highlighted in your handout, which I didn't have much time to talk about, there was an increase in the enrollment of Roman citizens at Bessa starting in the Hadrianic period. This reflects not only the desire of individuals to be associated with Hadrian's deme, but also the broader demographic changes following the establishment of the Panhellenion, which encouraged greater settlement of Roman citizens in Athens. All in all, our current understanding of Bessa remains limited by the absence of systematic excavations and detailed historical research. By incorporating more interdisciplinary approaches, my goal is to deepen our knowledge of Bessa and its role within the larger context of Roman Attica. Thank you.